Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me, and Happy New Year. This is our first live broadcast of 2021, and I hope that you had a great weekend. I hope that as we go into 2021, it's a little better than 2020. We'll see how that plays out. One of the questions maybe you have is, how did you do financially? Well, we're still going to count the various donations that come in through the mail, but I believe we've met our match, and so thank you very much for that. We do have information about that. I believe that we even have a spot coming out by Bob Allen that's going to say thank you for that. So I won't get into that in any more detail at the moment, but some of you like to know that, and that is indeed the case. Commentary today, of course, deals with a number of issues. The first one listed on the new year, and then we're going to get into some other topics that we have posted on the website there as well. But this is going to be quite a week. It, as a matter of fact, is illustrated by the first article that I've posted here, which is entitled, "A Week That Will Change America." Now, I don't want to overplay this. It's going to be very significant because we have 2 U.S. Senate races in Georgia tomorrow. That is important enough because if those both go to the Democrats, you have a 50-50 split in the Senate, and then the tiebreaker always being granted by the vice president, which you assume would be Kamala Harris, which then makes it essentially a Democratic Senate, and all sorts of things that might have been prohibited. The Senate might have been a stop to some of the more radical progressive ideas of a Biden presidency, certainly would not be there. So that would be reason enough. But, of course, before we even get to the idea of a Biden presidency, we have to get across the next day, which will be January 6th on Wednesday, in which there will be now a very obvious challenge to the Electoral College vote. You have dozens, it looks like now, of members of the House of Representatives that are willing to challenge, and you look like you have at least a dozen in the United States Senate, led in part by Ted Cruz, although, again, let's give credit to some of those who stepped forward earlier. But anyway, we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. So it all relates very much to a week that will change America. Now, again, I think Brittany Bernstein has done a good job of kind of summarizing it, but let's not overplay this. The challenges are certainly legitimate and certainly constitutionally permitted. And so people that are accusing Ted Cruz of sedition, that goes beyond the pale. Some of those that are convinced that there has been a theft of the election and we should have people go into the country with arms, as some have suggested, that goes beyond it. But at the same time, it will be an interesting week, and we're going to be talking about every bit of it here on Point of View. So let's go into the first article. You can read it for yourself, but I want to pick out at least a couple of highlights and then add some commentary as we go along. Because she says, when a new Congress convenes, 2 runoff elections in Georgia that will determine party control of the U.S. Senate and the presidential electoral count vote will all take place this week, and it will be a whirlwind. So first of all, you began yesterday with the swearing in of the 117th Congress on Sunday. That took place at noon. Controversy started right off the bat because you had Representative Emanuel Cleaver, it's hard to say this with a straight face, who ends by saying "amen" and "aw woman." Okay, I mean, first of all, amen is not gendered, okay? It is, amen means, so be it, or truly, whatever. So we got a problem right from the start. I won't even get into this because a lot of it has to do with the decision being made that we are not in the House of Representatives going to use words like mother, father, son, daughter, grandmother, at a time when people pointed out that Nancy Pelosi's Twitter account still mentions that she's a mother and a grandmother. So we can't even get it straight when we have the prayer and the opening statements. But nevertheless, we did have the swearing in. And then we had the vote that was for Nancy Pelosi. She had to bring in one representative who tested positive for COVID so that she would have enough votes to actually be Speaker of the House, which tells you a lot about how tight and narrow the margin is, which will get worse because at least 2, now maybe 3 Democrats in the House of Representatives, if indeed Joe Biden is the next president, there's reason to believe that is the case, will then go in the administration. And then for a time until you have runoff elections, you will have then an even closer margin than you have right now. And of course, you had 3 Democrats just the other day that said they were not going to vote for Nancy Pelosi. So you can see that she's going to be dealing with just razor thin margins anyway. So there you go. Then, of course, during this first meeting, they are now adopting rules to govern the January 6th joint session. And this could either clarify, maybe add additional processes, or maybe even prevent certain kinds of objections being brought about. So we'll see where that plays itself out by basically tomorrow. We may look at this before the end of the show today, but we'll see if any of those rule changes might have an impact on the January 6th joint session. Again, if you've only joined us and have not heard us talk about this before, this has always been kind of routine and perfunctory, although there have been 3 times there have been challenges in the modern times to the Electoral College vote, 1968 or actually 1969, and then you had one for the 2004 election, which was in 2005, and then you had the most recent one with the election 2016 that came in January 2017. All 3 of those by Democrats. This one will be by Republicans. But nevertheless, this is where the joint sessions of the House and Senate come together, count the votes in the Electoral College, and then there are sometimes, at least 3 times in modern times, in which there have been challenges. And if the challenge is significant enough, they break into the Senate considering the issue and the House considering the issue. And so we'll see where that takes us, and that will be taking place on Wednesday. I told my producer, Steve, keep me a little bit open here on Wednesday because we may be giving you a little bit of a point-by-point update on what's happening, but we'll see where that goes. And this electoral vote count could prove long and contentious, he says, especially given the fact that in this case you would have the vice president, Mike Pence, who would have to formally certify Joe Biden's victory. And so this, as she says, the certification fight pitting the president's committed allies against the Democrats and those Republicans who have acknowledged Biden as the president-elect could serve as a preview of what's to come should, again, Biden take office, as I think many people believe he may, with a divided Congress and dealing with such issues as funding the government. If we have trouble certifying the electoral results, you can kind of see where this might take us in the future. But she also points out then, should Democrats win both runoff elections, taking control of the Senate, Biden and Democratic lawmakers would likely face far less resistance in instituting very left-wing policies, though Democratic infighting could remain a roadblock to the party's legislative goals. So this goes on to remind us of the election taking place tomorrow in Georgia. And I'll probably have more to say about that in the national hour when our Georgia listeners are with us. But if nothing else, it does a reminder that this may be a week unlike one we have seen any time in the opening sessions of Congress. And so all the more reason to pay attention to what is taking place. And that's exactly what we plan to do right here on Point of View. Got a lot more to cover, and I will do that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
This year, there will be great pressure put on politicians and healthcare officials to extend lockdowns in an effort to curtail the health impact of the pandemic. In past commentaries, I've talked about the devastating social and economic impact lockdowns have had. They've also been a major factor in widening the gap between rich and poor. Stephen Moore, in a recent column, reminds us that Democrats and liberal economic advisors obsess about income inequality. Many of the policy pronouncements we will see in 2021 will be justified morally as a way to reduce the gap between rich and poor. But the biggest driver in widening the income gap has been the lockdowns. The president of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition argues that the majority of the up to 17 million households at risk of losing their homes this winter are people of color. Another survey found that minorities and the poor have been more vulnerable to job and income losses from the ensuing economic crisis, in large part because Black and Latino workers are overrepresented in the service industries wiped out by the shutdowns. Meanwhile, one of the richest men on the planet, Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, makes $321 million every day. He's also complained about how the lockdowns exacerbate inequality, but it's also worth mentioning that Amazon has been the world's biggest beneficiary from locking down brick and mortar stores. So who's pushing these lockdowns? Well, the New York Times listed the 10 states with the strictest lockdown orders. What do they have in common? They all have Democratic governors. People who can work from home, along with people who are guaranteed a steady income, aren't adversely affected by lockdowns. But lockdowns are crushing people on the lower income scale and aren't going to benefit much from a small government check. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Again, thank you for those of you that have sent in your financial support for us, and we certainly were able to meet the match, and we'll talk more about what looks like in the future. We'll still, of course, make it possible for you to donate in 2021. After all, we certainly have needs in January, just like we do in December, but it was certainly looks like a pretty good month, and I want to thank you so much for your financial support. Let me take on the second article I've posted, and again, I'm going to just give you kind of a brief overview, but it's by Michael Barone. Always had such respect for Michael Barone. He's been on the program occasionally with us, but he has certainly been somebody I've watched over the years, and this particular article, I'm quoting this one from the Washington Examiner, is The Year America Went Crazy, 2020. And if nothing else, he spends part of his time talking about COVID-19, which I'm going to get to in just a minute, because I haven't spent as much time talking about the vaccine. The other day, as a matter of fact, a week ago, I think at this time is when we did the interview talking about why you should consider the vaccine, and spent some time talking with Dr. Steven Weinberg. Today, I want to give you the other side and talk about why there are many people that are very concerned and are not taking the vaccine. And so what I always get is if I'm talking about the reason to consider the vaccine, then the anti-vaxxers get upset. Today, I guess when I talk about the dangers or the concerns that people raised about the vaccine, I'm going to have the pro-vaccine people getting upset with me. And before it's all through, everybody will be upset with me, but that's just the way life goes. And I just, I got broad shoulders. I can take it and really don't mind because many people say, well, I want you to give us the facts so I can make up my own mind. Well, how do you get the facts if I only give you one side? So I'm going to give you both sides in just a minute. But let's go to Michael Barone for just a minute because he said, did America go crazy in 2020? I suspect observers years hence will think so because of the responses of both the elite officials and ordinary Americans to the COVID-19 epidemic started in February and to the shocking Minneapolis police video released over Memorial Day weekend. He says response to COVID-19 was unprecedented and he says disproportionate to the threat. You think? Probably so. Initially, the epidemic evoked memories of Ebola and SARS, diseases not readily contagious but fatal for roughly half of those infected. Intensive testing, contact tracing, and quarantines were indicated then and initially were hailed as effective in some of the island countries. That'd be Taiwan, Singapore, South Korea, New Zealand. But in a continent-sized, global connected United States, a disease that is highly contagious but often asymptomatic could not be stamped out that way, of course. And a respiratory ailment with a lower fatality rate among those under 65 than a bad year's influenza certainly didn't justify the extended lockdowns and restrictions on others. No garden seeds that threw the economy into sharp reversal and devastated many low-wage workers. And my commentary today is on lockdowns. It's not been posted yet on the website, but sooner or later I suspect it will be posted. And we will certainly focus on some of that later in the program. He goes on to say that worries that proved unwarranted about overwhelming ICUs resulted in responses such as the New York Governor Andrew Cuomo's order sending COVID-19 patients to assisted living facilities. And, of course, those were deadly mistakes. And then he points out something else that we've talked about before. COVID-19 split Americans on partisan lines, with Democrats pushing for and Republicans pushing against strict lockdowns. Experts lionized by the legacy media were often no help, disparaging international travel bans as xenophobia, then endorsing interstate travel bans, saying people shouldn't wear masks, then saying that they must, bashing people who throng to wind-swept beaches and cheering others thronging to tightly packed anti-police demonstrations. And, of course, then he leads into the next one, and that is these mostly peaceful demonstrations where protests of an arrestee's death in Minneapolis recorded in a shocking video. This incident seems to have convinced millions of Americans, with encouragement from the legacy media, that the nation faced a sudden upsurge of white police officers killing innocent blacks. And then he goes through, of course, Black Lives Matter and a number of other issues, and the whole question of whether or not, again, there was an overreaction. There was a legitimate reaction and even a protest to, of course, the death of George Floyd. But as we've tried to document, even going back to Ferguson, Missouri, and some of the others that he talks about here, we certainly are not seeing the kind of epidemic in terms of police brutality that may have existed in the past. And he, to his credit, talks about some of that way back decades before. So, nevertheless, again, a piece on a week that will change America. Number two, the year America went crazy. And since he talks about COVID-19, I thought for just a minute, let's get into this whole issue of the vaccines. One of the arguments that people might want to use against getting the vaccine is the fact that people who actually know a lot about medicine aren't getting the vaccine. I first read about this, of what was happening in California. The article that I've posted is the third article, and I first read about in Riverside County in California, where at least 50% of the frontline workers said they were not going to get the vaccine, which leads to one of my favorite lines that I use on this program. What do they know that we don't know? Because if there's anything that's been a push, it's been the push for the fact that this is what we need in order to get herd immunity, same crazy line, but nevertheless, that's what they call it, and thus get us back to normal. And when you have half of the frontline workers in Riverside County who are individuals that are actually in the public health arena, These are doctors, these are nurses, these are orderlies, these are all sorts of individuals working in the hospital. What about that? Well, this article goes a lot further than that because it then documents that you have some of the other issues as well. Let's pick a couple of states. How about Ohio? The governor of Ohio, Mike DeYoung, just the other day disclosed that about 60% of the nursing home workers in his state have chosen not to get vaccinated. Okay, what about New York? About half of New York City's EMF workers have also shown skepticism. And as you start looking around the country, you start seeing all sorts of similar issues. We're broadcasting today primarily in the state of Texas, although I know we have listeners in Nevada, Minnesota, of course, all sorts of people listening online. But if you just take Nevada, we'll just use Texas. Texas, best example. Here you have a doctor at the Houston Memorial Medical Center who said that half the nurses in his facility, that would be the Houston Memorial Medical Center, said they would not get the vaccine. Then some of those in the Kaiser Family Foundation survey that was also done of Texas nurses found that 29% of the healthcare workers said that they were vaccine hesitant. So, some of this can be back to another favorite line. Somebody didn't get the memo. For 6 months, we've been saying this is done by Trump, and we don't trust Trump. This is done by Operation, warp speed, and this has been done too quickly. So we all have been convinced that this is too dangerous, so we won't take the vaccine. Then with the election of Joe Biden, everybody's saying, oh, no, we're going to get the vaccine. And now you even have some of the individuals who are Democrats getting the vaccine to show that they're going to, and Anthony Fauci's getting it. And maybe it's possibly that some people didn't get the memo that all of a sudden now that doesn't look like Donald Trump will be the president, well, then that's okay. You can get the vaccine. But you also have the situation being floated now by Anthony Fauci, who said just the other day in an interview with Newsweek magazine that the COVID vaccine might be mandatory for you to attend school, might be mandatory for you to travel. And so that has come up with this idea of a COVID-19 vaccine passport. And I've pointed out the other day that already in Israel, the travel company says they're not going to allow anybody to travel without proof of vaccine. In Spain, they've created a registry in which they're going to list people who refuse the vaccine and share that with the EU. And so now Republican Senator Mitt Romney is now saying maybe what we need to do in order to get the vaccine to more individuals is to actually enlist veterinarians, combat medics, and a variety of others in an all-out national campaign to administer coronavirus vaccines. So we're starting to see all sorts of interesting intramural debates starting to take place, and the least of which is the fact that people who have a medical degree, a nursing degree, or work in a hospital, you can find at least 50%, sometimes as high as 60%, and in one case as low as about 30% that are saying, nope, I'm not going to get the vaccine. So anyway, thought I would report that to you. It's information that's coming down the pike. We come back, we'll talk about this idea of voter fraud. It's going to be a big issue on Wednesday. We'll talk about that right after this.
Everyone here at Point of View Radio wishes you a joyous 2021, and we begin the year with a great big thank you. We are thankful for everyone who supported our $100,000 matching challenge in the final days of 2020. Thanks to you and so many others, we reached our goal. You gave, another friend matched your gift, doubling your impact, and we promise to be the best stewards we can be in using those gifts in the smartest ways possible to continue our nearly 50-year mission of bringing you the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, grounded in biblical truth. You have our greatest appreciation for your sacrifice. And if you were away and didn't get a chance to give, we are making a push to add more listeners, and your gifts now will help us reach more people. pointofview.net/year-end and 1-800-347-5151. Together, we will make a difference in 2021. pointofview.net/year-end and 800-347-5151. Again, from all of us at Point of View, thank you for your partnership. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let me give you kind of a preview. In about a half an hour, we're going to be talking with Dr. Rebecca DeYoung. She has written this book. Actually, this is a second edition of this book called Glittering Vices, a new look at the 7 deadly sins and their remedies. Just a very good book, and I thought it would be just fun, especially as we get to this new year and we're trying to figure out how we're going to make our way through 2021 after just barely crawling through 2020. We want to look at virtues, obviously, but this one looks at vices, and I thought it was really probably very appropriate for the first broadcast of 2021. And then in the second hour, we'll get back into some of the issues here in the news that we've been talking about. And just before I get into this whole idea of election fraud and what's happening in Georgia and how even claiming that there was fraud in Georgia has forced some people or caused some people to not want to vote in what I think is going to be very consequential Senate elections. But before we get to that, I realized that I had skipped one of the other articles we've posted. And it, I think, comes back to something I mentioned just a minute ago, and that is when we talk about these vaccines, we're starting to perceive that there's a bit of hesitancy, maybe, dare I even say, resistance to this. So what's going to be the impact? Well, I suggested one, and that is that Mitt Romney, who is a Republican, in name only sometimes. No, I shouldn't do that. But, you know, I've had a chance to interview him and everything else. He has really, in some respects, said, we've got to get this vaccine out here. So he basically has said, let's not just have doctors and nurses administer the vaccine, but let's have veterinarians. You feel okay with a veterinarian giving you a shot? Well, I think so. If they can give it to my dog, why can't they give it to me? And a number of others that are going to be doing that. And that's because he just feels like it's going too slowly. But I think there's going to be a different issue, and that is when we start running into some of this resistance, there are going to be people saying, look, we've got to do this. And if indeed we have a Biden administration and a Secretary of Health and Human Services who actually has already served in California, they're going to want to mandate some things. And at the same time, there are going to be some proposals that maybe would never have been considered before being pushed forward. One of those is by the way, my Viewpoints commentary now on lockdowns is now posted. Thank you, Karen, because it, in some respects, makes some of the same arguments that we made Friday with Penna Dexter. And that is, there's pretty good evidence to suggest that the lockdowns don't help a great deal. Their benefit is minor. The cost is huge, and I think we all know that now, but we didn't know it back then. And yet there's going to be a push, I suspect, with this incoming administration to actually push again in that direction. But the solution is to actually have people act responsibly. But what if they don't? Well, that brings me to my fourth article, and that is the idea of COVID camps. Now, this just strikes you as the most bizarre, but at least one lawmaker in New York has introduced a bill that would allow the government to detain people deemed to be a potential public health risk because of the issue of COVID-19. This particular bill, 416, calls for the removal and or detention of individuals who are identified as a case, contact, or carrier of a contagious disease. Now, to be fair, he actually has posted this particular piece of legislation before, and of course it went nowhere. Will it go somewhere this time? One would hope not, but nevertheless, you can understand that if indeed you're in one of these hot spots, New York, California, you can obviously say we can have all the lockdowns we want, but if there are people traveling around with this contagious disease, the so-called typhoid Marys, then we've got to do something about them. And so this would actually allow the governor or a health care official to unilaterally approve such a detention. And then you can have a court order, which is then going to be required within 60 days of confinement, and a judicial review is required to see if the person should still be in detention after 90 days. So again, you might remember the conversation we had with Kelly on Friday, and we've also had with Jonathan Saenz. we have in emergency situations maybe delegated entirely too much authority to a governor, to a county judge, to a health official. And so there is, I think, going to be a real push, for example, in the Texas legislature and maybe other legislatures, to redefine what those emergency orders can actually allow. But here in the state of New York, you have a bill that not only wants to constrain the actions of a governor, but to enhance them dramatically. And of course, you've had all sorts of reactions to it about the fact that this reminds you of something you've seen before with detention centers and the rest. But you can see where some of this could surface, in large part because if we can't get control of the pandemic, and we can't get people to actually take the vaccine, we've got to do something. And so you can see where that goes. And of course, that gets us back to the comment I mentioned just a few minutes ago, in which in an interview with Newsweek, Dr. Anthony Fauci really floated the idea that the coronavirus vaccine would probably become mandatory for school attendance and even for travel. And he explained the possibility of even developing what might be called a vaccine passport. And in case you think that that's something he's just thinking about hypothetically, an article I posted a while back, which you can read, I think it's in the Friday issue here from CNN, talks about some of them that have actually tried to develop through what's called the Common Trust Network, an initiative really by this Geneva-based nonprofit, the Commons Project, to actually then partner with various airlines. And that would be JetBlue, Lufthansa, Swiss Airlines, United Airlines, Virgin Atlantic, and others, in order to give you something that could be on your cell phone, which then you would put down just as you do when you actually show your ability to get on the airplane. You know, lots of times people don't even get a paper ticket. They just simply get it on their phone. So you'd have the first one, which would go click and show that you have the vaccine passport. Then you'd scroll, go to the second one, click, and that would then put you on the airplane. And so those are the ideas that are being used right now. The Common Pass app that they've developed would be something where you can be tested every time you cross a border, or else you get a digital yellow card, which then provides proof of vaccination. So these are some conversations that are being had, in large part because there may be a resistance to this idea of people who, even though the vaccine is available, aren't taking it. The issue at the moment, which I think we need to mention as well, is not that we have all these vaccines that people aren't taking. The issue is we have more people that want to take the vaccines than we have vaccines. And, of course, that's been used to criticize the Trump administration as well. And I saw an ombudsman the other day that pointed out, and he said, look, I'm a liberal and I don't even necessarily like Trump, but please, nobody in the press gave Trump credit for Operation Warp Speed, and no one gave him credit for the idea that we would have vaccines available in 2020. And so finally, when it is, nobody said, oh, okay, maybe we made a mistake. They just turned right around and said, he's not getting them out fast enough. And so, you know, the president cannot win. And, of course, again, maybe he made extreme statements like we'll have 20 million vaccines available by the end of 2020. No, we had more like about 2 million. But the bottom line is, right at the moment, there are more people that want the vaccine than vaccines are available. But very quickly, if these numbers that I just mentioned in the previous segment are true, we're going to have more vaccines than people that want to take them. And we're going to move down the priority list pretty quickly, because right now we're moving pretty much, I think, to some of the second tier individuals that are over the age of 65 that have some particular issue. But at the same time, we could move even further down, because there are some, including nursing care facility operators, who don't want to take the vaccine. So we'll see where that takes us in just a minute. Anyway, let me take a break. When we come back, one of the other articles I was going to post is actually a piece that came into Newsmax vote fraud claims were not baseless. Right now we're having people making the comment that these claims are being made without evidence or baseless. One of the phrases used, unproven. Okay, I will accept that because they haven't been proven in a court of law, which is why we need to have some kind of discussion. I'm not sure Wednesday's the best place for it, but anywhere is a discussion. But I want to take you through real quickly what he has summarized as some of the fraud claims and the surprise by how few now are being cited from Georgia. We'll come back to that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and then we're going to spend some time talking about the 7 deadly sins and some of the vices that we need to pay attention to as Christians. But let's talk about voter fraud, and I will get into it more in the next couple of hours because we'll have our friends from Georgia joining us, and that's where a lot of the attention is being paid. But there's a very good piece that came out in Newsmax, and it's entitled Voter Fraud Claims Were Not Baseless. And Michael Dorstowitz spends some time going through at least some of the claims that have been made. Now, again, just because you've made the claim doesn't necessarily mean that it has been verified. Again, let's recognize that a claim needs to have scrutiny. In just a minute, I'm going to talk about some of the counterclaims to these. Those need scrutiny, too. So I'm trying to be fair with this. But as I read through this, it was kind of intriguing because, first of all, it goes through Nevada, and there's like 5 paragraphs of material there from Nevada. Then Arizona, there's a couple paragraphs there. Then Wisconsin, there's about 5 paragraphs of evidence that he cites there. Then Michigan, there's about 4 paragraphs there. And then Pennsylvania, about 4 or 5 paragraphs there. And I get to the end and I'm going, something's missing. Georgia. And I went back, and Georgia is like the smallest section. And I thought that's interesting because, as you've heard Kelly Shackelford say on more than one occasion, he thought that one of the better examples of what could be voter irregularities, some which might be fraud and others just they didn't follow the right procedures, would be Georgia. And he does mention the bombshell video that we've seen where after the poll watchers are ushered out, then they go back to counting ballots. Okay. And I thought, why is it that's I thought would have been the longest one, and it was the shortest one? Well, it brings us back to the fact that now a lot of people have been doing, if you will, fact-checking on the Georgia votes. And this article I have in front of me here, which goes on for 4 pages, and this was done by the Associated Press. I found another one by the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, goes on for a couple of pages, and it takes on some of the allegations made by the Trump administration or the Trump campaign, and gives, I think, in many cases, some reasonable answers to some of those. And it illustrates again why, in some respects, this particular summary by a person who obviously is convinced that voter fraud has taken place, that he has very few examples out of the state of Georgia, because as people have taken the time to look into it, they've been able to answer in many cases, not all. And again, just because you have a counterclaim doesn't mean that I accept it any more willingly than the other claims, because let's have an opportunity for an evidentiary hearing where both sides get to present their case and then respond to the counter arguments. But it is kind of intriguing. But the one thing that went through my mind is, why did the Associated Press decide to actually talk about answering some of these claims about there being voter irregularities or voter fraud in Georgia? Why didn't they wait 2 days? Because after all, this particular thing that they've posted here, this fact check, might encourage more conservatives who even the other day on the air were saying they weren't sure they were going to vote. Well, it might encourage more of them to go and vote. Why didn't they wait just 2 days if indeed they want to influence the election? And then it occurred to me, well, I know why. It's because of a phone call that you probably have heard about by now by the president, and the audio recording, which was obtained by the Washington Post and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, in which the President Donald Trump, had a 62-minute phone call with the Georgia Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, and also his legal counsel, which is Ryan Germany, in which he was arguing, I think as strongly as he could, that the data is wrong because he was convinced that he had won Georgia. Now, I'm not going to get into all the details, although I'm sure there will be others that will want to try to exegete everything the president said in this particular phone call. But now there are some that are suggesting that he could be impeached over it, which, again, he's not going to be impeached. We know that's not the case. Or that there was a crime that was committed. And now that you can look at the long, detailed transcript, and I haven't, but I have seen some people that I have reasonable trust in that have said they've read the whole transcript, saying that some of this was, I know this would surprise you, taken out of context, but nevertheless, it's a good illustration as to all of a sudden why some of these various concerns about fake Georgia votes are now not necessarily being cited. And it will be, to me, very interesting to see what evidence is cited by, let's say, Senator Ted Cruz on Wednesday, and whether they will be citing some of those things which at least the Associated Press, Washington Post, Atlanta Journal-Constitution believes have been debunked, and whether they have answers to that or not. But I think it is kind of interesting that if you look at some of the examples that they use, one of the arguments is that many of these individuals who voted no longer live in Georgia, so those should be illegal votes. Well, the response comes back and said you were looking from a particularly dated argument or article, and some of those people have indeed moved back. So it isn't necessarily the case that they have. The question about individuals that voted and they were out of state, I think, was illustrated by the other day, in which you had one of the Georgia election officials who realized that the person that he purchased the house from, who now lives in Maryland, nevertheless voted in Georgia using the house that he now lives in. So there's one good example of somebody out of state. We had some others in which they claimed that dead people were voting, and the claim was that maybe 5,000 people, so-called zombie voters, actually voted. Well, again, the argument is that's not true. They did find some individuals who looked like they had voted illegally, and when they tracked them down, they found that some of those individuals actually have the same name as the people that supposedly were dead voting. So you can go through this, and just because you make a counterclaim doesn't mean that it has any more validity than the original claim. But it illustrates again why we need to have some kind of mechanism to sort some of this out. Ben Shapiro put it best the other day. He said, we really do need to have some way in which we can evaluate some of these voter irregularities, some of these claims of voter fraud. He says, I'm not sure Wednesday in front of the House of Representatives is the best place, but we do need to have something like that. And this hand-waving is simply saying these are baseless, these are claims made without evidence. Well, there seems to be some evidence, but some of the evidence also doesn't seem to stand up to scrutiny. And that's where we find ourselves right now. So I am more than eager to see what will be presented on Wednesday and what kind of reaction, both from the point and the counterpoint sides, have to say about some of this. And that's why we are going to continue to cover that right here on Point of View. Well, let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to spend some time talking about glittering vices, a new look at the 7 deadly sins and their remedies. If we want to live as godly Christians in this world, I think you're going to really appreciate some of the work of Dr. Rebecca DeYoung. She writes for this particular article and also has published some other books and articles on this subject, and as an individual that teaches at Calvin University. So we'll take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into some of the issues in the news. But first, we're going to spend some time talking about how to make sure that we don't fall prey to some of the 7 deadly sins, which are certainly those kinds of topics that we should be addressing. I certainly would love to hear sermons preached on some of this. I'd love to have individuals addressing this so that we as Christians can live godly lives before the watching world. Let's take a break. We'll talk about these vices and these 7 deadly sins right after this.
Everyone here at Point of View Radio wishes you a joyous 2021, and we begin the year with a great big thank you. We are thankful for everyone who supported our $100,000 matching challenge in the final days of 2020. Thanks to you and so many others, we reached our goal. You gave, another friend matched your gift, doubling your impact. And we promise to be the best stewards we can be in using those gifts in the smartest ways possible to continue our nearly 50-year mission of bringing you the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, grounded in biblical truth. You have our greatest appreciation for your sacrifice. And if you were away and didn't get a chance to give, we are making a push to add more listeners, and your gifts now will help us reach more people. pointofview.net/year-end and 1-800-347-5151. Together, we will make a difference in 2021. pointofview.net/year-end and 800-347-5151. Again, from all of us at Point of View, thank you for your partnership. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View.
And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. We're going to spend some time today kind of looking at the flip side. Sometimes we talk about virtue and how to grow as a Christian. We're going to talk about the 7 deadly sins, the vices that sometimes affect us as well, because that's going to be really important as we grow as Christians. And I thought that this would be a great hour just to really focus on that from a book that actually has been around for some time. When it first came out, Glittering Vices, and about 2009. Sold about 35,000 copies. It was a C.S. Lewis Book Prize Award winner. It is now in its second edition, has been updated and revised, and provides a chapter on grace and growth and things of that nature that you will find very helpful. And it is written by Dr. Rebecca DeYoung, who is a professor at Calvin University, has her PhD from the University of Notre Dame, has taught ethics and the history of ancient and medieval philosophy, author of previous books, which would be Vainglory, and even co-authored a volume entitled Aquinas' Ethics, this one called Glittering Vices, and it deals with a new look at the 7 deadly sins and their remedies. So, Dr. DeYoung, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure to be with you.
I might just mention that you said, you know, when you first started your professional training in philosophy, especially in graduate school, you kind of felt like, I think some of us did, that you're surrounded by all sorts of people that are smart and witty and well-read and all that, and kind of wondered why you were there. But then you came across kind of the contemporary treatments of what we call the 7 deadly sins, and in some respects said maybe there's a need to go back and look at some of the original writings on that, and in some respects take Christians to a point of thinking about these areas that so beset our Christian growth. And in some respects, that's how the book was born, isn't it?
It is. My own personal experience is what sort of catalyzed this study for me. I was had a very familiar experience of stepping up into graduate school and finding things very challenging for a number of reasons, and thinking, wow, I just wonder if I could pull this off. And it turns out one day I was in the library reading the Summa Theologia, of all things, by Thomas Aquinas, and he named this vice for me. This name for my struggle was pusillanimity, which is quite a mouthful. But it sort of illuminated my own experience. And from there I started digging and realized there was a whole tradition of naming and identifying these vices, which was so eye-opening, both for me and my students. And so when my students resonated with my own experience in grad school and found these vices as a kind of path toward illuminating their own struggles and then also giving us a way forward, I thought, maybe we should write this down. Maybe we should find a way to translate this ancient tradition for contemporary Christians. And that's the story behind the book.
Let's again talk about why study vices rather than virtue. You know, we do a lot on apologetics here, and sometimes one of the criticisms that comes is you spend so much time talking about false views, you just need to preach and teach the good views. Well, and I'm not discounting that, but sometimes as you certainly know God's Word more effectively, you can actually begin to find heretical ideas and false ideas. There is a sense in which, wouldn't you agree, that even though we want to teach virtue, and I know that you have spoken on various campuses, both high school and college campuses, talking about virtue, in some respects we can also learn some things by looking at these vices, can't we?
Yeah, I think it's a helpful way to start. I think when you catch people at a moment of struggle, similar to my experience in grad school, I think that creates a kind of solidarity, a kind of openness in the sense like, look, we're all struggling with something. And the sooner that we can name it and bring it out into the light, the sooner we can find brothers and sisters who can walk with us into healthier ways of living, better ways of life. And that's really what Christ's invitation is, to join him on that path.
What about this idea that you also address early on, that maybe this is just kind of old-fashioned? We've outgrown some of these. I think you talk about an individual, we're going to talk about gluttony later on, that says, oh, you know, that's maybe not even something we should think about here in the 21st century.
Right. Our culture tends to trivialize sin in all of its forms, whether we're talking about the 7 deadly sins or sin in general. It's just not a topic they want to take seriously. And I think that's deeply misleading in the sense that people know when they're struggling. And then if all there is to do is to make fun of those struggles, I think you're leaving people hanging. You might leave them looking for more. And the Christian tradition has so much to offer here. And I think part of what is helpful about investigating the vices is getting names for things. There's something about sort of recognizing what your deep diagnosis is that can then catalyze a way forward that brings healing or a treatment regimen. But until you have a precise diagnosis, you don't really know what you're working with, what you're struggling against. And that leaves your future strategizing a little too vague, a little too open-ended. So I think this is actually a path toward freedom, to have names for things and to actually take that struggle very seriously.
I love your medical diagnosis and medical model for that, because I think all of us at one time or another have had a friend, maybe it's even happened to us, where we know something's wrong, we can't figure it out, and finally a doctor gives you a name for it. And it doesn't mean that you got cured, but finally you have at least an understanding of what it is, what its symptoms are, and you also recognize, I'm not crazy anymore. So there's a sense in which that's a great model. But just before we take a break, let's talk about, and again, this is going to be a really short history, you've got a whole chapter on it, in terms of how this idea developed. You mentioned Aquinas, and those of us that read the Summa, that's in the 13th century, but you take us back to what you call some of the Desert Fathers. Can you kind of give us a brief overview?
Sure. The Desert Christians were a community of early Christian folks who had just pulled themselves away from culture because they recognized the ways in which they were tempted to assimilate and to sort of start grasping for worldly power and pleasure. And so they followed Christ's example, quite literally, in his desert temptations, and went off to a place where they could be very intentional about pursuing Christ-likeness and following his way of life. And what they discovered is that they didn't bring the world with them into the desert, but they brought all the garbage in their hearts right along with them. And so this was kind of a diagnostic project for them. They called themselves physicians of souls, so that's where the metaphor comes from. And their project was to sort of look at what bubbles up in the wilderness and then try to name it, address it, and find ways forward that would free us from those entangling sins.
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, again, there's a whole chapter that explains that, but I just figured if nothing else, some of you might be listening. You might write on a piece of paper 1 to 7. We're going to go through those, and I think you're going to find that these are maybe topics that really need to be addressed. Some of you may say, I have never heard a sermon on any of these, and they should be. And these are things that we should certainly focus on in terms of wanting to be Christ-like and growing in Christ. So we're going to talk about some of these glittering vices with Rebecca DeYoung right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
This year, there will be great pressure put on politicians and healthcare officials to extend lockdowns in an effort to curtail the health impact of the pandemic. In past commentaries, I've talked about the devastating social and economic impact lockdowns have had. They've also been a major factor in widening the gap between rich and poor. Stephen Moore, in a recent column, reminds us that Democrats and liberal economic advisors obsess about income inequality. Many of the policy pronouncements we will see in 2021 will be justified morally as a way to reduce the gap between rich and poor. But the biggest driver in widening the income gap has been the lockdowns. The president of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition argues that the majority of the up to 17 million households at risk of losing their homes this winter are people of color. Another survey found that minorities and the poor have been more vulnerable to job and income losses from the ensuing economic crisis, in large part because Black and Latino workers are overrepresented in the service industries wiped out by the shutdowns. Meanwhile, one of the richest men on the planet, Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, makes $321 million every day. He's also complained about how the lockdowns exacerbate inequality, but it's also worth mentioning that Amazon has been the world's biggest beneficiary from locking down brick and mortar stores. So who's pushing these lockdowns? Well, the New York Times listed the 10 states with the strictest lockdown orders. What do they have in common? They all have Democratic governors. People who can work from home, along with people who are guaranteed a steady income, aren't adversely affected by lockdowns. But lockdowns are crushing people on the lower income scale and aren't going to benefit much from a small government check. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Rebecca DeYoung, Glittering Vices, a new look at the 7 deadly sins and their remedies. Second edition, book's been out for some time, but again, the new edition is one that helps you really begin to deal with these various issues. I might mention that each chapter ends with a series of questions for further reflection, and then also some for further reading. And so this is something which you certainly could study individually, but I also know that many of you listening are in church leadership. You may be a pastor, a Sunday school leader, a Bible fellowship leader, a small group leader. If you wanted to take a group through this, it would be available as well. And so we have information about her and about the book on our website, pointofview.net. Well, Rebecca, if we can, let's work our way through all 7, if we can, in the hour that's remaining. And the first of those is vainglory. Now, I think for a lot of our listeners, they might say, okay, I've never heard that phrase before. That seems like a new kind of word. Sometimes you could use the word pride, but that's not what it's really getting at. It's the desire for recognition. It's the individual that has to put his or her name on everything, has to get credit for everything. And if you start understanding that, you can understand that maybe even our social media culture has reinforced that in pretty significant ways. But what can we learn about this idea of image and being concerned about our image and getting recognition?
Well, you're right. Vainglory is an unfamiliar word, but I think the phenomenon is as old as time. St. Augustine criticized the Romans for being obsessed with their own glory and honor, and I don't think there's anything new under the sun with us either. Even if we do have smartphones now, we certainly have exactly the same kinds of issues with seeking attention and approval from other people in excessive and disordered ways. I mean, the vainglorious person is really trying to prop up a public image that looks better than what she really is. And so there's the lure of fame here, I think, except that there's also, I think, a religious version of this. When you remember Jesus' criticism of the Pharisees in the Sermon on the Mount, what is he criticizing them for? Well, one of the first things out of his mouth is, you're standing on the street corners trying to pray better than anybody else and look more religiously respectable than anybody else. So it's easy to criticize celebrities and their quest for fame, except that we have vainglory right in our own backyard, right in our own congregations. And so I think that is a struggle for Christians yet today, something that's important for us to wrestle with.
And again, I know that this is something that you so strongly believed in that you actually wrote a book called Vainglory, The Forgotten Vice, which is published by Erdman's, came out about 6 years ago. So in some respects, this is something that you could spend an entire hour on, and we'll keep moving down here. But let's talk about this, because we might talk about the fact that what is worthy of glory. There are times when indeed people take too much credit for something that they shouldn't. And yet we are, as Christians, if nothing else, really want to work for the glory of God. And so I think there's always a little bit of a struggle. I'll use myself as an example, or other teachers or preachers. When you give a great message, you give a good sermon, you give a good lecture, you give a good Bible study, and they come up and say, isn't that wonderful? What I try to do is point them back to, isn't that passage in Romans 8 really powerful? Or isn't it amazing what that particular quote? So that you try, at least in this celebrity culture, to take it off of the individual and put it back on that which deserves glory, and that is God's Word. How can we begin to deal with this issue, since, of course, you've written an entire book on the subject?
Well, I think you're right to point out that there are many good things that we need to celebrate, and maybe even celebrate better as Christians. I mean, celebration is a spiritual discipline as well. Along with worship and gratitude and encouragement. Those are all spiritual gifts we can give each other. The question is, are we excessively seeking those things, or do we recognize that our goodness ultimately comes from God? And I think that's where, for example, St. Augustine has so much to teach us. Do we recognize that every bit of goodness in the world, even the goodness that we call our own, is essentially a gift from God, and something that should help us to point to him and celebrate him. But that doesn't mean that practices like gratitude and encouragement, or setting a good example, or in parenting, affirming our children and their goodness, those things are all really important for, our normal development as people, but also for our spiritual development. So you're right. You have to find this tricky balance between the right kind of affirmation and the disordered form of affirmation. And that's why this desert community found discernment to be such an important part of their daily practice. They needed to do this together as a community. If you're a preacher, isn't it more helpful if your congregation has realistic expectations of you and isn't sort of demanding sensationalism and hype? I mean, wouldn't that be just a huge relief to worship leaders if they didn't have to compete with the best rock band out there for worship credibility? They could just offer what they have and be affirmed in the goodness of that.
Well said. Let's keep moving. Though, again, the book is entitled Glittering Vices. The second one is Envy. And Rebecca, years ago, I put together a sermon on envy. And the reason I did that was, first of all, I thought, since I'm the old guy there, I'd probably spent a half a century in church, and I don't remember ever hearing a sermon on envy. And yet I remember people saying that my sin of youth was lust, my sin of old age was envy. And then when I look at the Old Testament, you think of Joseph and his brothers, there's envy. You think of King Saul and David, there's envy. I began to realize there's a lot in Scripture about envy, and I'd never heard anybody actually preach a sermon on it. I'm not saying mine was any good, but I am saying that in some respects that's the second particular deadly sin, and it seems to me one that we should certainly guard against today, now in the 21st century.
It's one of the sins that really isn't very fun. I mean, one of the features of these vices that's prominent throughout the list is the way that they attract us with their sort of false promise of bringing us happiness. And so we get sucked into that folly, that false promise. But envy, boy, that's a tough line. Envy makes you miserable. What's behind this vice? I think that's the most interesting question. And the way that the tradition talks about envy is that it sees your own sense of self-worth as comparative. So I'm not good enough unless I am better than you. So rather than receiving God's love sort of unconditionally, it will say, I'm only lovable if I'm more lovable than you are, or if I'm somehow superior to you in some way. And wow, I mean, think about the project of trying to be superior all the time. It's exhausting and impossible. So envious characters show up all the time in this competitive world that we live in. So you think about Disney characters here, Scar in The Lion King, Maleficent in Snow White, Syndrome in The Incredibles, Woody in Toy Story. I mean, it's all about being better than or being competitive in the wrong sorts of ways because we're operating out of a lack of a sense of our unconditional worth before God. So if you can recapture that sense of how loved you really are without any conditions, without any comparisons, you're on your way to overcoming envy.
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into some others, which I think will be very surprising to you. One of those is sloth, and we will get into that. And then we'll talk about avarice or greed, and that one certainly makes some sense there as well. We'll get into wrath, as well as gluttony, which I mentioned earlier, and lust. So there's quite a number to cover. And if you are appreciating this book, again, it's trying to draw on literally centuries of wisdom from Christians who've come before us, and we can certainly learn a great deal, and talks about how sometimes, as it's called, glittering vices, we're kind of attracted to that which is glittery, which is really a false substitute for what really is the good and the loyal and the true and the right. And so we're going to come back and spend a little bit more time talking about this book. It has been updated and revised, and it looks at, of course, these 7 deadly sins, a topic that we rarely address here on Point of View, and a topic that isn't always even addressed in church. And that's why we thought it would be appropriate today for you to begin to, if nothing else, put a name on some of the things that maybe you've been struggling with, so that as you really kind of plan the future and begin to plan for what you can do to address some of those sins that sometimes beset you and beset us, that you'd have at least an understanding of where they come from, what they manifest themselves as, and why we need to reevaluate what is happening. And so much of this was true in previous centuries, but as you can see with the first 2 we've just mentioned, just think about how social media has accentuated both of these, this idea of wanting to get credit for everything and wanting to get likes. Even the whole idea of envy, everybody else seems to have the highlight reel of their life, and you get kind of envious. Well, as we work our way through, you'll see there are some others that we can address, and we will do that right after these important messages.
Everyone here at Point of View Radio wishes you a joyous 2021, and we begin the year with a great big thank you. We are thankful for everyone who supported our $100,000 matching challenge in the final days of 2020. Thanks to you and so many others, we reached our goal. You gave, another friend matched your gift, doubling your impact. And we promise to be the best stewards we can be in using those gifts in the smartest ways possible to continue our nearly 50-year mission of bringing you the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, grounded in biblical truth. You have our greatest appreciation for your sacrifice. And if you were away and didn't get a chance to give, we are making a push to add more listeners, and your gifts now will help us reach more people. pointofview.net/year-end and 1-800-347-5151. Together, we will make a difference in 2021. pointofview.net/year-end and 800-347-5151. Again, from all of us at Point of View, thank you for your partnership. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
How can we grow in Christ and become more Christ-like? Well, one of the ways is certainly to address some of those sins, some of those vices that are part of your life. And so that's one of the reasons why we're working our way through this book, Glittering Vices, a new look at the 7 deadly sins and their remedies. This is a second edition. We have lots of information about both our guest, who is Rebecca DeYoung, and the book on our website, pointofview.net. And Rebecca, if we might, for just a minute, recognize that as we work our way through the 7, there are a few that maybe are probably harder for people to understand, and one of those is sloth, or acedia is the kind of the technical term for it, because you're going to have a lot of people saying, oh, well, that's not my problem. I'm just working so hard. I'm just, nose to the grindstone. Nobody would ever accuse me of slothfulness. Yet I know you've even written about that in various books and articles and other kinds of things. But that chapter, I think, really helps us understand that in some respects, we're not just talking about laziness, although that's part of it. We're also talking about diligence and a variety of other things, aren't we?
Yeah, the secret to the vices is to realize that they are a hurt condition. So you can't always identify a particular outward symptom and say, oh, that person has that vice and this person has this vice. The behavioral symptoms are a clue, but the real problem is internal. So with sloth, the real issue is that you have a resistance to growing in your commitment and your relationship with God. You want his love to be sort of safe and comfortable, but not stretch you and make you grow and be challenged. And so the response to sloth can be sort of escapist, like, oh, let's distract ourselves with lots of other things, either entertainment things or maybe even work or maybe even ministry. The other symptom, external way that sloth shows itself is sort of apathy, a kind of checking out, right? Like I just don't even want to think about it. So they're both ways of kind of avoiding what God is calling us to do, which is to grow in his love.
And so, again, you provide some alternatives there as well. And I might just mention again for people that might have just joined us that you have whole sections after each chapter on further reflection, maybe even thinking about areas of your life or situations where you're most tempted to escape from the demands of love, and then some further reading and material as well. But let's move on to one that certainly I think people can relate to, and that in Chapter 6 is avarice, or what many people might refer to as greed. And this is something that was identified even by the so-called Desert Fathers when they lived pretty much lives of poverty. So if it was true for them, if it was true for the disciples who lived lives from our perspective of poverty, you can see the potential temptation that we face because we're some of the wealthiest and healthiest Christians that have ever lived on this planet, aren't we?
Yes, so greed is a major challenge for us. I think it's the air that we breathe. Our temptation here is the default assumption that our stuff belongs to us, rather than our money and our possessions being a resource that belongs to God for use in his kingdom. We think of that, those things as our own. And so as soon as you can get free of this idea that you are the owner and master of your possessions, then you're going to be on your way to moving away from greed. I think one of the more powerful pictures of this is in the movie Dunkirk, or actually in the historical event, where you have a sort of national crisis and the need for this enormous rescue of troops on the shores of France. And everyone uses every available resource, no matter who it belongs to get over there and rescue those people. So there you see a situation in which human need trumps who owns what. We just use whatever we have on hand to serve. And I think you need these pictures of how to get out of a greedy mindset. And once you see how inspiring and beautiful that can be, greed tends to lose its luster.
One aspect that is maybe confused by a lot of people is the mistranslation or the misremembering of 1 Timothy 6:10, that money is the root of all evil. the actual statement by Paul is the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. And what you have, first in the Christian tradition sometimes, is the idea that if I take a vow of poverty, I'll never have to deal with greed again. Wrong. Number two, since I also talk politically, you can also see kind of the Marxist idea that the reason we have greed is because we have a capitalist system, and that eventually we will change human nature by creating a different cultural superstructure, and we'll eventually move to socialism and communism, and there will no longer be any greed. And so that's a naive view as well. So whether it's a Christian view or a very secular Marxist view, there's a misunderstanding of the nature of greed, isn't there?
Yeah, so the key to greed is that it is attachment to your possessions. So the question isn't how much stuff you have. The question is how attached are you to it? And I think, you know, a large part of what's behind our greed is a desire for security and self-sufficiency. And once you dig down to that desire, now you're getting to the root of the problem, regardless of how many possessions you have or what economic structure you have. That's not the key feature here. I think this is just sort of a lack of trust in God's provision, and that is something that everyone struggles with, regardless of where they are in history or what economic structure they're a part of.
In talking about the book Glittering Vices, and I thought we would come to the one called Wrath. Now, some of you might say, well, okay, that one doesn't apply to me either. I've never killed anybody. I've never even hit anybody. But you start off by talking about kind of having the Damascus Road experience in which you're trying to figure out, why is this traffic all blacked up and everything? And then you see this individual, actually turns out to be a pastor carrying a cross walking down the road, and you're all upset with them. And I would say that you, in your vulnerability, remind us that, okay, maybe we've never actually physically hurt anybody, never really even been wrathful in that sense. But I would ask any of our listeners to remember the last time somebody cut them off on the freeway. Sometimes somebody wasn't moving quick enough, somebody that nearly backed into them or did back into them in the parking lot. What was their first reaction? It probably was wrath. So again, this is something which we deal with in this very tense, high-pressured world that we find ourselves in here now in the 21st century.
Yeah, I think it's humanizing to think about all the little ways that these vices creep into our lives. We don't need to sort of finger point at the big bad villains out there. We can all look within and find plenty of work to be done. I personally find that this vice is deeply about control. It's about my own agenda, what I want, and when I want it. So sometimes we'll even act like we're on God's agenda, but not his timetable. So we're impatient about when the kingdom will come or how it will come or how justice will get done, and we want it done on our own terms. And I think being behind the wheel is a beautiful metaphor for the spiritual life here. I want my hands on the wheel, and I want to be in the driver's seat. And when people threaten my power and control behind the wheel, including if God threatens that, then wrath is a very natural human response, albeit a sinful one.
Just before we take a break, let's talk about this, because we do understand God's anger. We also recognize that there is a, if you will, righteous anger. So in some respects, part of the key is to recognize that anger in and of itself may not necessarily be wrong. There are times when that would be justified. Are there times when Jesus was angry? Sure. Are there times when Paul was angry? Of course. And so in some respects, it's the sorting that out, isn't it?
It is with all of the vices. I mean, what we're doing in each case is taking something that could be good, could be used well, and treating it with either excess or some other kind of disordered aim. So anger as an episode of, say, a hunger and thirst for righteousness, I mean, in that respect, we're patterning our anger after God's. But we do have to watch out that it doesn't become a habit, because if you look at the Old Testament refrain about God's character, it's something like this: God is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. And that's ultimately what we're seeking to be like.
Well, let's take a break. When we come back, we'll look at the last two, gluttony and lust. And right off the bat, let me just hasten to add that your definition of gluttony may not necessarily be this particular definition that we're going to talk about. And so we'll get into that. And, of course, we've left lust for the last one because it's one of the last chapters in the book, but also it maybe is one that we tend to spend a fair amount of time talking about on this program. But if you find yourself saying, okay, I'd like to find this book in my local bookstore. Probably should be there, but if not, we have a link to it, and that allows you to buy it in paperback and Kindle. Might also mention, if you click on the picture of Rebecca DeYoung, you can actually find out more about her at Calvin University and the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship, and a number of other materials that are linked there, including some of her books. So we have all of that available at our website, pointofview.net. We'll come back and look at those last two seven deadly sins, and once again talk about some of the remedies. All that coming up right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation with Dr. Rebecca DeYoung for just a few more minutes. And again, we are focusing on some of these seven deadly sins and their remedies. And Rebecca, I thought we would focus on gluttony. And a good illustration of that is that people always think that it means overeating. But if anybody has ever read C.S. Lewis's Screw Tape Letters, you might remember that actually one of the devil postings actually is that we've convinced people that they no longer have a problem with gluttony because it only relates to overeating or the gluttony of excess. Instead, he talks about the gluttony of delicacy. So in some respects, when we talk about gluttony, not exactly a sermon topic that anybody has heard in the last few decades. In some respects, we have a misunderstanding of what it means, don't we?
We do, and I wish people would do sermons on it because I think it's deeply important in our culture. I mean, look at our culture's relationship to food. It strikes me that there's plenty of work to be done there. There's plenty of struggle to be excavated. It's true that we don't want to conflate gluttony with overeating. We don't want to conflate it with external symptoms that might not have anything to do with a spiritual problem internally. So, we already do plenty of blaming and shaming of people who have weight problems, and that is pretty much not the point here. The point is that, again, the vices point to difficulties and struggles that we have as part of the things that our hearts are attached to or overly attached to. So I would define gluttony as a disorder in which you are too attached to pleasure and self-gratification over the purpose of eating. So you'd be willing to, for the sake of pleasure, do things that are bad for you, either spiritually or physically or both.
There's another aspect of that, and that is if you're talking about this, and one of the things I like about this is the book not only talks about the sins, but their remedies. In this chapter, you talk about gluttony's remedy is fasting. Now, again, we tend to always think fasting of food, and that's the primary focus, but there are all sorts of other issues as well. If earlier we've talked about the fact that sometimes these digital devices in our lives cause us to deal with envy and vainglory and a variety of others, maybe we're talking as well about something like a digital fast. But talk about this for a minute, because you've actually encouraged some of your students to actually think about fasting in different kinds of ways. Can you explain?
Yeah, we've actually thought about practices of detachment in general as sort of one way to both figure out what am I struggling with and how intensely am I struggling with it? Where do I need to do the heart? Where do I need God's Spirit to do some heart surgery on me? And part of that is a matter of thinking about the spiritual life in terms of practices or disciplines. I have a number of people that I know who have done military service, and what they'll tell me is that when they go on a mission, they will have to have the kind of self-discipline they need to carry out their mission. That might mean going without food for a while. That might mean eating less than appealing food for a while. That might mean eating meals ready to eat in the middle of the desert for a number of months. They're prepared to do whatever they need to do and to sacrifice whatever they need to do in order to carry out their mission. And that's a good way to think about the practices of detachment, fasting, or anything else. They're just sort of a double check, a test to see whether I'm willing and able, without complaining and grumbling about it, to give up whatever I need to give up to carry out my mission, which is to love God with my whole heart and soul and mind and strength. And if you think about your relationship and your attachment to pleasure that way, it seems to me that there's plenty of room for both conviction and for practices of detachment on a regular basis. As a double check, not that you're detaching from things that are necessarily bad, you're just double-checking that you're not, again, your heart's not too attached to them.
Well, the final one, of course, is lust. And if we have a society which has problems dealing with food, we really have a problem in our society with people dealing with sensuality and sexuality. And that, of course, is the last of these 7 deadly sins. And once again, just shows a heart problem in addition to kind of the sexual dysfunctions and things of that nature that have surfaced as well.
Right. It's a question of why are we so attracted to lustful forms of sexuality over healthy ones? And I think, one of the things that I point out at the end of the book is that sometimes we're driven by fear. We really don't trust God's love for us. We really don't trust Him to provide for us. And if you're coming out of that kind of internal deficit, you're going to be acting in ways that are desperate, perhaps dangerous, even dehumanizing to yourself and others in the long run, because you're so eager to get something for yourself that you're either not sure you're worthy of, or you're not sure that you'll be able to truly find the right form of. And so I think there's a fair amount of kind of desperate loneliness and lack of the right kind of intimacy behind a lot of our, the various forms of lust in our culture. We're willing to dehumanize other people in those relationships sometimes because that's safer for us.
Yes, well, it certainly is. Last chapters deal with, of course, self-examination, the 7 capital vices, spiritual formation, even an epilogue. And so in the few minutes we have remaining, Rebecca, can you just share how people can use this book? I've recommended that it could certainly be something that an individual can pick up, read through, and respond to. But I know we have quite a number of people that maybe are looking for something that could really challenge the spiritual growth and spiritual formation of groups under their spiritual care. And so you've written it in such a way, I think it also could be a group study, couldn't it?
It certainly could. And in fact, I've been more intentional about crafting it in that way, suggesting exercises to try together some of the experiments my students and I have done in class at the end of each chapter. I think the first edition, I focused too much on the vices because that's what I had discovered, and I thought it was interesting. And people came to me who had read the book and said, well, where's the grace? And once we find out what's wrong with us, then what next? What do we do next? And so this new edition has really focused on how do we look forward? How do the vices draw us into a greater reliance on God? And what practices, what ways of life can embody that greater reliance and that growth in love? And so the new edition is more intentional at the end of each chapter at offering us practices that open us in receptivity to God's love and ways that he wants to change us and help us to grow. And so if we do that in a group with grace and accountability, I think that's an even more powerful way to approach this material.
Great material here on growing in godliness and really the gift and practice of conforming and being conformed, not to the world, but to Jesus Christ. And so if nothing else, Dr. Rebecca DeYoung, it has been a delight to have you on the program. I appreciate you writing not only the first edition, but revising and creating the second edition. And thank you for giving us an hour today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much for having me.
Going to take a break, but just before we do so, let me just mention that, again, we've looked at those 7 vices of vainglory and the issue of image, envy, feeling bitter when others maybe have it better, sloth or acedia, this whole idea of resistance to demands of love, avarice or greed in possessions and mastery, wrath of the emotion, but sometimes a passion, gluttony of, in some respects, feeding your face but starving your heart, and then finally lust, the whole idea of sexuality stripped down, just an attempt to draw upon literally centuries of wisdom from other godly Christians that we can apply to us in the 21st century. And if nothing else, recognizing sometimes we get captured by things which are glittery, those glittery vices, and are false substitutes for true human goodness and happiness. So that's why we took some time today talking about this and giving you information on our website, pointofview.net, in case you'd like to get a copy of the book. And you've been listening to Point of View.
Everyone here at Point of View Radio wishes you a joyous 2021, and we begin the year with a great big thank you. We are thankful for everyone who supported our $100,000 matching challenge in the final days of 2020. Thanks to you and so many others, we reached our goal. You gave, another friend matched your gift, doubling your impact, and we promise to be the best stewards we can be in using those gifts in the smartest ways possible to continue our nearly 50-year mission of bringing you the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, grounded in biblical truth. You have our greatest appreciation for your sacrifice. And if you were away and didn't get a chance to give, we are making a push to add more listeners, and your gifts now will help us reach more people. Pointofview.net/year-end and 1-800-347-5151. Together, we will make a difference in 2021. Pointofview.net/year-end and 800-347-5151. Again, from all of us at Point of View, thank you for your partnership. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me for the Monday edition here of Point of View. And we are going to have one of the busiest and perhaps one of the more controversial weeks in our nation's history. Matter of fact, that's the first article I've posted here, a week that will change America. And I thought, if nothing else, wanted to start off last hour by not focusing on news and information, but it's time to get back into it. So let's do that. And of course, there are going to be a lot of comments about Georgia for very good reasons. First of all, we have a U.S. Senate election, actually two of those tomorrow in Georgia, so we're going to talk about that. If that's not enough, of course, there is the conversation that took place between President Donald Trump and the Georgia Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, as well as Ryan Germany, who is the Secretary's legal counsel, which the audio recording was obtained by the Washington Post, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and a number of others. And we will get into that in due course. So obviously, I want to hear from those of you in Georgia. That has also led to something very interesting, in which the Associated Press has done some fact-checking on some of the questions about voter fraud in Germany, which has led to, interestingly enough, people that have been alleging voter fraud are not using some of those arguments, which I think illustrates the fact that maybe they were allegations, but there may be some reasonable answers for those, which all the more comes back to a point we made on Friday. But I'll make it even more strong now for our Georgia listeners. Go out and vote. Matter of fact, you're going to be, many of you will receive an email in which we encourage you to do so. Even as Kelly said, even if you were convinced there's only a 1% chance, I always love how he goes to extreme, 1% chance that there wasn't a voter fraud, wouldn't you still want to go out and vote? And the bottom line is there many of those voter fraud claims in Georgia are now at least being questioned. And, of course, I can't wait to hear on Wednesday which particular claims are used in this Wednesday conversation that will be taking place and the debate that will be taking place in both the House and the Senate. But I'm getting ahead of myself, so let's get into a few of the articles I've posted. And if you find yourself saying you'd like to read them in their entirety, we have those posted on our website at pointofview.net. This particular one from Brittany Bernstein says that when a new Congress is convening now, you also have two runoff elections that will determine the party control of the U.S. Senate. And, of course, you have the electoral vote count on Wednesday. So the first week of 2021, it's going to be a whirlwind. And right off the bat, of course, you had yesterday on Sunday the swearing in of the 117th Congress, which was then followed by a vote that was to determine who the Speaker of the House was. To show you how we can't get anything right, we had the opening prayer by Representative Emmanuel Cleaver. He ends by saying, "Amen," and "Ah, woman." Right off the bat, you just got to roll your eyes a little bit. Amen is Latin for like so be it or truly. It's not gendered, and so just even there you had a problem. Then you had the vote for the Speaker of the House. We now know that Representative Gwen Moore tested positive for COVID-19 and came in and vote anyway because the vote was so close that Nancy Pelosi needed every vote she can get. Now, if indeed Joe Biden becomes the president, his cabinet will at least take 2, maybe 3 members of the House of Representatives, Democrats, out, and then you'll have to have runoff elections, which means that her vote margin will be smaller than ever, the smallest since, I think, 1921. Never had a Speaker of the House have so little to work with in terms of a vote margin, especially when I think there were at least 3 Democrats that said they were not going to vote for her. I don't know. I didn't check the count to see if that's the case. So that's how yesterday went. Today, of course, what is Congress doing? Well, they're adopting the rules that will govern the January 6th joint session. This could either clarify how the vote will be taking place or could add additional processes to this. We'll be watching how that discussion takes place today. Maybe we'll report on it tomorrow. Certainly we'll have a better idea of what that will take place on Wednesday. And again, all of that takes place because ultimately you will have the vice president, who is Mike Pence, who will then rule as to whether or not to certify the victory of Joe Biden or to allow, because it is established in a law that actually comes from the 19th century, that if you have at least one member of the House, one member of the Senate in writing challenge the electoral vote total, and we have dozens in the House and about a dozen almost in the Senate that have said they will challenge this, then you're going to have a certification fight. Now, where that takes us, nobody knows for sure. I still think that it's going to be extremely difficult, talk about an uphill climb, to see anything other than the ratification of Joe Biden as the president-elect. But that's why we will, of course, be covering this every day. But let's get back to Georgia for just a minute, because Georgia is certainly in the news a lot. Have you noticed that? Those of you from Georgia, I want to hear from you today. By the way, we'll open up the phones for your comments, 1-800-351-1212. Why do these Georgia Senate elections matter so much? I think you know, but let me again read from this piece by Brittany, because should Democrats, she say, win both runoff elections, which doesn't look too likely right now, but who knows, given the fact that you've had an incredible amount of turnout so far, then Democrats could be taking control of the Senate. They'd end up with something that would be more like 50-50. But again, given the fact that you have the vice president-elect, assuming that would be Kamala Harris to vote, then Democrats would be in control. And so in some respects, Democrats, if they could have both control of the House, which they do by narrow margins, and the Senate, then that tie-breaking vote by Kamala Harris would give them control, and all sorts of things that before might have been stopped or slowed down by the Senate simply disappear. It's led some people to make the argument, somewhat compelling, that it would change the nature not only of the Senate but of the country if indeed you get rid of the filibuster, if indeed you all of a sudden then begin to change some of the election laws, if you indeed also state that both the Puerto Rico and District of Columbia would be states, you would have 4 more Democratic senators. You could at some point say maybe you would never elect again a Republican president, maybe never even have a Republican Senate in the future. So it would be interesting to see how this all plays itself out. So right now we'll see how that does take place. But if nothing else, we have, of course, all sorts of other issues being presented, not the least of which is the fact that Representative Mo Brooks from Alabama, along with dozens of other House Republicans, would object to the Electoral College results, thus assuming he would lead the debate there. More recently, Senator Ted Cruz, along with others, have said that they would challenge it. Of course, Josh Hawley being the first one from Missouri, but now Ted Cruz, and actually presenting that information in the Senate. It's going to be a busy and interesting week. Stay tuned. We've got a lot more to cover right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
This year, there will be great pressure put on politicians and healthcare officials to extend lockdowns in an effort to curtail the health impact of the pandemic. In past commentaries, I've talked about the devastating social and economic impact lockdowns have had. They've also been a major factor in widening the gap between rich and poor. Stephen Moore, in a recent column, reminds us that Democrats and liberal economic advisors obsess about income inequality. Many of the policy pronouncements we will see in 2021 will be justified morally as a way to reduce the gap between rich and poor. But the biggest driver in widening the income gap has been the lockdowns. The president of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition argues that the majority of the up to 17 million households at risk of losing their homes this winter are people of color. Another survey found that minorities and the poor have been more vulnerable to job and income losses from the ensuing economic crisis, in large part because Black and Latino workers are overrepresented in the service industries wiped out by the shutdowns. Meanwhile, one of the richest men on the planet, Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, makes $321 million every day. He's also complained about how the lockdowns exacerbate inequality, but it's also worth mentioning that Amazon has been the world's biggest beneficiary from locking down brick and mortar stores. So who's pushing these lockdowns? Well, the New York Times listed the 10 states with the strictest lockdown orders. What do they have in common? They all have Democratic governors. People who can work from home, along with people who are guaranteed a steady income, aren't adversely affected by lockdowns. But lockdowns are crushing people on the lower income scale and aren't going to benefit much from a small government check. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let me just mention that our second article that I wanted to read from is by Michael Barone, The Year That America Went Crazy, 2020. And I thought I just might mention, I've said this before, but it's worth saying again, and you're going to hear this a little bit later by one of the announcements by our announcer, that indeed we had a very good 2020 due to your generosity. So again, we want to thank you for that. We were able to meet the match, and again, we will be counting some other donations that I'm sure are still coming in the mail. I'll give you a full report a little bit later, but just wanted to say that even though 2020 was a crazy year, as Michael Barone talks about, and it's one that we don't want to ever have happen again, nevertheless, you've been very generous, and I want to thank you for those of you that have supported this ministry. Recognize as we come into 2021, we still, of course, need your financial support, but we're so grateful indeed. So, Michael Barone, an individual we've had on the program in the past, not as much now. He's a senior political analyst. He writes for the Washington Examiner and was on various talk shows over the years. Asked the question, did America go crazy in 2020? He says, I suspect observers, years hence, will think so because of the response of both the elite officials and ordinary Americans to COVID-19 epidemic starting in February, and then to the shocking police video released over Memorial Day weekend. I won't focus so much on the second one. We've talked about that before, but it was interesting to see his comments about the fact that the response to COVID-19 was unprecedented and disproportionate to the threat. He said initially the epidemic evoked memories of Ebola and SARS, diseases really not readily contagious but fatal for roughly half of those infected. So as a result, intensive testing, Contact tracing, quarantines were indicated then and initially were hailed as effective, especially in some of these island countries, and that would be like Taiwan or Singapore, South Korea, New Zealand. But in a continent-sized, globally connected United States, a disease that is highly contagious and often asymptomatic could not be stamped out that way, and a respiratory ailment with a lower fatality rate among those under 65 than a bad year's influenza certainly didn't justify the extended lockdowns and restrictions on others that threw the economy into sharp reversal and devastated many low-wage workers. Before I go on, let me just mention that Penedexter's commentary, which we talked about on Friday, we actually sent out to those of you that are on our Viewpoints mailing list. That arrived in your inbox on Saturday. My Viewpoints commentary today deals also with the lockdowns, a lot of it coming from the research by Stephen Moore, who just reminds us that this, if nothing else, has rather dramatically widened the income gap between the rich and the poor. Rich people, Jeff Bezos, he makes $321 million every single day. Not year, every single day, $321 million. But what about those people in service industries? What about those people that were in the hospitality industry? What about the poor, the minorities and others? They've been hurt terribly by the lockdown. So, again, one of the things that Michael Barone is talking about, I document a lot more in my Viewpoints commentary today, in case you want to read it. And, of course, if you sign up to receive it, we send it into your inbox. Mine come to your inbox Monday through Friday. Penedexter's comes on Saturday. Let's see if we can get back to the piece there, because he also points out that COVID-19 split Americans on partisan lines, with Democrats pushing for and Republicans pushing against strict lockdowns. Experts lionized by legacy media were often no help because they first disparaged international travel bans as xenophobia and then endorsed interstate travel bans. First, they were saying people shouldn't wear masks. Then they were saying that they should. First, they were bashing people who went to windswept beaches and then cheered others who went to tightly packed anti-police demonstrations, and then goes on to talk about the irony of even referring to these as mostly peaceful demonstrations because, of course, the loss of life from George Floyd is, again, just a tragedy, but the comments being made really ever since, as he points out, Ferguson, Missouri, illustrates again that this whole idea of police brutality, which was very much a thing back in the 1960s and 70s, which he documents later in this piece, has been, I think, somewhat debunked by, as I've mentioned before, people like Heather McDonald. But anyway, that is our second article that I thought you would want to see. And since he's talking about COVID-19, just before we take a break, let me talk about the vaccine, because the other day we had, of course, Dr. Steven Weinberg on to talk about why you might want to get the vaccine. Let me now give the other side, some reasons why you might be hesitant about the vaccine, and that gets to our third article, this one from the New York Post. But before I even get to that, let me just mention I began to notice something even last week. Because out of California, we were starting to hear that individuals who were public health officials, for example, in Riverside County in California, they at that time found that 50% of these frontline workers in Riverside County in California opted not to get a vaccine, not to get immunized. These are the people on the front line, okay? These are doctors, nurses, health officials, administrators, others in hospitals and things like that. 50% said, nope, I'm not going to get that. Let me jump around the country for just a little bit to illustrate the point. Let's go to Ohio. Our listeners up in Ohio might be familiar with this. Governor Mike DeYoung the other day disclosed that about 60% of the nursing home workers in his state have chosen not to get vaccinated. Okay, let's go to New York. Already more than half of New York City's EMS workers have shown skepticism, according to this. I'll take one more since I'm in the state of Texas. We'll talk about the Lone Star State here. One doctor in the Houston Memorial Medical Center already reported that half of the nurses in the Houston Memorial Medical Center would not get the vaccine. And so you're starting to see some, and then they did some surveys of all the nurses. This came from the Kaiser Family Foundation survey, and found about 29% of healthcare workers were what they called vaccine hesitant. I can go through more of this article, but you can read it on your own. But it illustrates the hesitancy, and it gets back to one of my favorite lines. What do they know that we don't know? I mean, these are people with, in some cases, a medical degree, a nursing degree, a public health degree. Maybe they're just working in public health. And you're starting to see as many as 60% and as maybe as low as 30% say, no, we're not getting the vaccine. And so that's kind of an interesting situation. At the moment, there is a real question as to whether or not we can get enough of the vaccine out, which has caused U.S. Senator Mitt Romney, who's a Republican, to suggest that maybe what the government should do is not only enlist doctors, but veterinarians, combat medics, and others in an all-out national campaign to administer coronavirus vaccines. And if nothing else, an illustration that maybe there will be more of a need than there are vaccines. But at the moment, we are seeing just the opposite. Yes, now many of you probably are in localities right now where you're having trouble getting the vaccine, because there is certainly a rush of people in their first or second tier that are saying, we want to get the vaccine. And right now, there are a lot of people frustrated trying to find a hospital or a doctor that would administer it. But you're starting to see some of the comments being made suggesting that maybe we're going to have to push the vaccine on people. For example, Dr. Anthony Fauci, you remember him, right? He already, on an article in Newsweek, floated the possibility that the coronavirus vaccine would have to be mandatory if you attended school or if you were to travel. Last week, we posted an article about a COVID-19 vaccine passport that you might have to get. Unless you think this is just hypothetical, you've got groups like the Common Trust Network really working right now to actually partner with various airlines like JetBlue and Swiss Airlines and United Airlines and Virgin Atlantic to come up with a Common Pass app that might be on your phone to demonstrate that you indeed have been vaccinated. And of course, we've had some people calling in saying they're already having people ask about immunization registries. You have one travel company in Israel saying that they would require proof of vaccine for us to even allow you to travel. And I've, of course, mentioned the other day in Spain, they've created already a registry for those who refuse the vaccine and plan to share that registry of people who refuse the COVID vaccine with all the other European Union countries. So a lot of things happening in that regard. And then even in New York, they're suggesting maybe creating COVID camps where if somebody is seen as a spreader, they could be removed or detained in a COVID camp. A lot more to come, but we'll take a break, and we'll certainly welcome your phone calls right after this.
Everyone here at Point of View Radio wishes you a joyous 2021, and we begin the year with a great big thank you. We are thankful for everyone who supported our $100,000 matching challenge in the final days of 2020. Thanks to you and so many others, we reached our goal. You gave, another friend matched your gift, doubling your impact. And we promise to be the best stewards we can be in using those gifts in the smartest ways possible to continue our nearly 50-year mission of bringing you the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, grounded in biblical truth. You have our greatest appreciation for your sacrifice. And if you were away and didn't get a chance to give, We are making a push to add more listeners, and your gifts now will help us reach more people. Pointofview.net/year-end and 1-800-347-5151. Together, we will make a difference in 2021. Pointofview.net/year-end and 800-347-5151. Again, from all of us at Point of View, thank you for your partnership. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour. I'd love to hear from some of you in Georgia if you would like to join us, because first of all, we have this very important set of U.S. Senate elections that take place tomorrow in your state. So I'd love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. Any thoughts or ideas about who might be the winner? Just the other day, we heard a number of you say you've been absolutely pilloried with and completely inundated, it'd be another word for it, of various ads and phone calls and television ads and all sorts of poll workers and all the rest. So I'd love to know your thoughts about what's happening in Georgia. That's number one. Number two, of course, we had over the weekend an audio recording that was leaked to the Washington Post and the Atlantic Journal-Constitution. And this was a 62-minute phone call between President Donald Trump and the Georgia Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, who, again, President Trump was trying to get access to some of the information, what you might call the work project and product. What did you, since you came to the conclusion that there was no widespread voter fraud, can we look at that? And of course, the answer was no. And so he talked with the Secretary of State and also the Secretary's legal counsel. That will be Ryan Germany. I will get to some of that in just a minute, because that has also led to the Associated Press putting out kind of a fact check about some of the claims of Georgia voting fraud. And I'll get into that because some of that comes from various research done by the Secretary of State. Some of it comes from the conversation, for which we now have all sorts of transcripts and the rest, which has led some people to, as we always expect, overreact, say the president should be impeached. This is a crime. Of course, people have accused of Ted Cruz of sedition because he wants to challenge this on Wednesday, which is, I think, his right to do so. Whether it was a Democrat or Republican, it's a right to ask questions, and I think questions should be asked. I wish we had a better forum for it, because Ben Shapiro said a while back, and I think it was right, we do need to evaluate this election, but I'm not sure Wednesday in a 2-hour conversation or debate in the House of Representatives and the Senate is any way to do that. And I probably agree, but since we have nowhere else, why not? So that is the case. But also, if you'd like to join us on the vaccines, I see one of our calls here wants to get into that issue. Before I get back to Georgia, let me just mention that my fourth article, because I just want you to read it. When you first read this, you think, oh, this has got to be a joke, or this has got to be something's made up. This has got to be fake news. No, not necessarily. There is a New York state lawmaker who has introduced a bill that would allow the government to detain people deemed to be a potential public health risk, and that this particular piece of legislation introduced into the New York State Assembly would call for the removal and or detention of individuals who have been identified as case, contact, or carrier of a contagious disease. Now, to be fair, I think he's introduced this before, but it went nowhere. Is it going to go anywhere this time? I don't know. I don't think it necessarily will, but I'm just given up trying to predict what could or could not happen. And so this would actually provide an opportunity for example, the governor or other individuals to actually have the opportunity, if they have clear and convincing evidence that an individual is spreading the disease. And so as a result, that person could be placed in detention. Now, it would also require then that even though a governor or health official has the unilateral approval to approve of such a detention, a court order would be required within 60 days of confinement. Judicial review would be required within 90 days. But at a time, as we talked about on Friday with Kelly Shackelford, in which you're starting to see some various state legislatures saying, you know, we need to go back and look at these emergency procedures and powers that we give to governors, county judges, healthcare officials in a pandemic, and maybe tighten them up a little bit. That certainly seems to be appropriate. But we have here, at least in New York, going the other direction, giving more authority to the governor to put people in a COVID camp. And again, I first thought, this has just got to be a joke. This has got to be some kind of fake news. But apparently, that's at least one individual that thinks that that is the solution. Of course, we also recognize the solution that a number of people in what could be the upcoming and incoming Biden administration on this issue of lockdowns, which is why my commentary today, I hope, would be helpful to you, because some are arguing that the reason the lockdowns didn't work back in March and April is because they weren't tight enough. Whoa. That it does not bode well as well. So anyway, we'll get into some of those issues, but I do want to give some of you a chance to comment on a couple of issues we put on the table, and we'll try to give preference to many of you in Georgia if you'd like to join. But first of all, let's go out to South Carolina, listening on the Good News Network. Charmin, thank you for calling today. What would you like to add to our conversation?
Hey there, Kerby. My husband's in law enforcement, so he was required. Well, he was voluntold to get the vaccine, which he did. And he was given a piece of paper, a documentation that proves that he's had the vaccine. And the nurse clearly said to him, you want to keep this, you want to put this in a safe place as proof that you've had the vaccine, because should you ever want to travel, you will need this. Well, the same week he went and got the vaccine, I went to my weekly doctor's appointment. I have a rare autoimmune condition. And in the examining room was the doctor, the PA, and the nurse. And I asked each of them, are you getting the vaccine? To which each of them replied, no.
Isn't that something?
So then I,
Yes.
And so then I said, now, doctor, do I get the vaccine? He said, absolutely not.
Yes.
You can't get the vaccine because of this rare autoimmune condition that you have.
Yeah.
And then I said to him, I said, well, will there be repercussions from not getting the vaccine? He said, no, there should not be. But now I'm wondering, will I be restricted from traveling because I cannot get the vaccine?
Let us hope that they have variations on this. And again, the idea of the vaccine is if we get herd immunity, there are going to be some people that for religious reasons, for medical reasons, for even political reasons aren't. But if we get the percentage up high enough, it won't be an issue because we have some families that kids don't get measles and mumps vaccine, a variety of others. So it's a possibility, but I'm just watching that. And if nothing else, you've raised a good question, because on Friday I posted this article. It comes from CNN, so you know it's got to be true. I'm being somewhat facetious, of course. On COVID-19 vaccine passports, you might need to get it to travel in 2021. Right now, no. Will that happen in the future? Question mark. And then the one I've posted today, just the alarming number of U.S. healthcare workers are refusing COVID-19 vaccine. That's one there today. And I'm just going to keep track of this. You know, some people the other day said, well, you had somebody on that was talking about vaccines, so you're pro-vaccine. I'm saying, well, I'm trying to give you information. So the other day I talked about all the reasons to get it from an individual that knows a lot about it and has been through 4 pandemics. Today I'm giving you some reasons to think maybe not to get it. And not the least of which is what are these healthcare workers who are saying no that I don't know? Yeah. So I'd like to know a little bit more. And I'll try to give you both sides, and I'll probably get criticized from both sides. I can't even imagine what my email is going to look like in the next few hours, but have at me. That's I've got broad shoulders. I don't mind. But anyway, let's pray for you, because if you have an autoimmune disease, last thing we need to do is do anything that would compromise that. Fair?
Exactly. Yeah. And I did ask the PA. I said, "May I ask you?" As I was leaving, because the doctor and the nurse left. I'm on a first name basis with her and have her in my cell phone, so I can just text questions to her. I said, "Can I just ask you, Lauren, why won't you get the vaccine?" And she said, "Off the record, there has not been enough time to test it."
Mm-hmm. Well, we recognize that. This time last week, we were just thinking about a pandemic and hoping it wouldn't happen. And I remember the first coverage I gave of it in January and said, well, that's all we know, and that's all I'm going to talk about today, because I really didn't know anymore and wasn't going to say anymore, although I had some concerns about what might happen, because I've read some of these books and articles in the past about what could eventually unfold on our planet, and having some people that actually brought Ebola to this this part of our world from Africa, because we actually brought them here to actually be treated and things of that nature, I was paying attention to those issues. So if nothing else, I appreciate you bringing that point up. And when we come back, I see some of you want to talk about the vote in Georgia. Just as a setup, let me just mention that one of the articles I was going to post, called Vote Fraud Claims Were Not Baseless, I was struck by the fact that it goes on for a good portion of a page talking about Nevada, Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. And I'm looking around going, where's Georgia? It's like 3 paragraphs, and really actually 3 sentences when you get right down to it. And it just mentions the video out of the particular situation that we've talked about before, when the poll watchers were asked to leave. And some of the other claims, I think, have now been somewhat set aside. It will be interesting to see which claims are actually cited on Wednesday, but we'll talk about that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. As a program note, let me mention that tomorrow we're going to have David French with us. He's written a book called Divided We Fall, and really talking about the need to really try to heal the differences that we have. So we'll talk about the book, but of course he's also been, if there's ever been an anti-Trumper, it would be David French. I mean, after all, he was one that thought about running against Donald Trump 4 years ago, but but more importantly, he's been one of those people that has taken some time to debunk some of these allegations of voter fraud. So let's get a chance to hear from him. If nothing else, I want to find the best arguments. You know, sometimes when we point out that this is not a good argument for voter fraud, doesn't mean I don't believe in voter fraud. I mean, after all, when I get these emails from people saying, you don't believe in voter fraud, I'm going, wait a minute. I'm the guy that's interviewed John Fund, Hans von Spakowski, Eric Eggers. I have a booklet on voter fraud. Yes, I believe in voter fraud, if for no other reason, because I believe in human sin nature. But I think some of the arguments that have been used are not very good arguments, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. But let's see if we can hear from Julie calling in from Georgia. Julie, I understand you've already voted.
I did, and as I was talking to the call screener, what I told him was, although I did vote and vote early and my entire family did, neighbors, we really don't have any confidence that our votes will count for Purdue and Loeffler because there is massive fraud in Georgia. We're very upset. Georgians are livid, to be honest, because we all saw the suitcase video and, you know, the infamous suitcase video. And then less than 24 hours later, Raffensperger's Secretary of State said, oh, there's nothing to see here. There's nothing unusual about that, and certified the vote. And, you know, he could have at least investigated, but he doesn't want the truth to come out, in my humble opinion. And people in Georgia are very upset. Stacey Abrams' sister, the judge, would not let them purge voter rolls, and that was just a couple of days ago.
Yeah, and then that was reversed, I might mention. But yeah, and you're bringing up some good points. Let me real quickly just try to answer some of that because, again, let's find the best arguments, and I'm hoping that Ted Cruz in the Senate uses some. You know, for example, this came out interestingly enough in the conversation, the conversation that Donald Trump had with Brad Raffensperger and also with Ryan Germany. One was the argument that we've had dead people voting, close to 5,000, the president said. Well, first of all, they found that some of those people that were cited as dead people voting actually had similar names. But, okay, to be fair, this Saturday, the Secretary of State in Georgia did say that some illegal votes had been cast on behalf of dead people, but so far they've found 2, not thousands. So, okay, I think 2's too many, but that's something to think about. The claim that the president made about people that moved out of Georgia and then improperly cast ballots. Ryan Germany, who I just mentioned a minute ago, who was on the call with the president, said that in many cases the voters moved back. Now, just because the counterclaim makes that statement doesn't end it, because I have the same philosophy about a claim and a counterclaim. I would love to have a situation somewhere where we could put this into a situation in which individuals that believe there was no voter fraud could make their case. People who believe there is voter fraud could make their case, and they could then literally cross-examine each other. That's how we do these kinds of things, and I suspect maybe there'll be some kind of lawsuit in the future that will allow that to take place, because we desperately need it. Because, Julie, as you just point out, a lot of people say, I just don't know if I can trust Atlanta. I don't know if I can trust Cobb County or Fulton County or whatever. First of all, I think all the eyes of America is going to be on what happens tomorrow, so we'll see that as well. But let's, if we can, take a few more phone calls, because some of you would like to share your story. So we'll go back to Georgia. And, John, what would you add to the conversation?
My neighbor across the street is a Black Christian, and he voted Republican, him and his wife both, but he said him and his wife both got 4 ballots each. I got a sister who lives in another city, and a black friend of hers, her and her mother both got 4 ballots each. All of them threw them in the trash. But, I mean, how many people that didn't throw them in the trash if those did?
Bingo. And I want to say that to David French tomorrow when he's with us, because, I think he believes that there's voter fraud, but there's not enough to have changed the election. Okay, but I won't put words in his mouth. But let's have a chance to hear from him. But to say that the individuals that we know, whether they got 2 ballots, I've heard some people telling me in Georgia they got 2 ballots, others got 4, to think that every person did the right thing is really straining credulity and actually illustrating, again, kind of a naive view about what all of this is. So if anything, it's just a great illustration of the fact that we need a further evaluation, and I wish it would take place on Wednesday, but I don't really have any hope, but we'll see. I'm just, if nothing else, wanting to make sure that we use the best arguments, just as we want to use the best arguments to defend the authority of the Bible, the best arguments for the existence of God. Sometimes I see some of these arguments being circulated, and I'm going, that one I think's pretty much been set aside. But okay, if you have more evidence, then share it with us. But let's stay in Georgia, and we'll go to Charles. What would you add to our conversation today?
Hello?
You're on the air.
Oh, sorry. Well, my name went blank when you started to speak. Anyway, I have been in IT for a long time, and when the state of Georgia put these new voting machines around and all the individual counties had an opportunity to go down and review them and test them out, and the representative from the Georgia Department, Secretary of State, our voting machines are such that you go to a screen, you select whatever president that you want and whatever other people that you want. It prints out a card. And this card has all the people on it that you selected, but then it has a QR code at the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
Who can read the QR code? So then you take the card that's been printed and you take it over to a separate machine and it reads it in there. And I asked one of the workers at the poll place, I said, how do I know that this QR code represents what actually is printed on the top? Because being a programmer, and you know yourself that just because you print something, you can print a code that means something entirely different.
That's a good point. That is something I never thought about. Yeah, it's a good point.
Yeah, there's no answer to that. The fellow from the Department of, from the Secretary of State, he had no answer for that. So I'm not confident in this election. I'm hopeful, but I'm not as confident as I'd like to be. And the other thing is, evidently, these machines can easily be hacked into by outside forces to change percentage points. So if it's a computer, it's not a good way to vote. I have to say it. I think the preferred way to vote is the old machine that you got in it, you pulled a lever, the curtain slid behind you, and you clicked the vote, and it just had counters on it.
Yep. And also just even a printing, because in our particular ones, we get both the electronic, but then does print something out. I'm pretty sure ours did not have a QR code, but you raised a really good question that I have not been asking, and I'm a precinct worker and precinct chairman, so it's something I'm going to look at myself. So we're just simply out of time, but Georgia is on our mind tomorrow, and so we'll spend some time talking with David French and some others, and if you'd like to join in, ask a question, make a comment, disagree with him, want to give you that opportunity. We will have more than an opportunity this week to look at what is going to be quite a week, not only in terms of the Georgia election, the two Senate elections, but also the challenging, most likely, of the electoral count, and we'll see how that plays out on Wednesday. So hope you stay with us every single day. Again, thank you for your interest in Point of View, for your financial support. Most importantly, I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. I hope you will be back with us tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Everyone here at Point of View Radio wishes you a joyous 2021, and we begin the year with a great big thank you. We are thankful for everyone who supported our $100,000 matching challenge in the final days of 2020. Thanks to you and so many others, we reached our goal. You gave, another friend matched your gift, doubling your impact. And we promise to be the best stewards we can be in using those gifts in the smartest ways possible to continue our nearly 50-year mission of bringing you the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, grounded in biblical truth. You have our greatest appreciation for your sacrifice. And if you were away and didn't get a chance to give, we are making a push to add more listeners, and your gifts now will help us reach more people. pointofview.net/year-end and 1-800-347-5151. Together, we will make a difference in 2021. pointofview.net/year-end and 800-347-5151. Again, from all of us at Point of View, Thank you for your partnership. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.